key assumptions that have shaped this curriculum. So we are deeply inspired and moved by all of the incredible work that other folks are doing to keep our communities safe, whether that's campaigns to close jails or fights to ban police surveillance tools. There are struggles that are reminding us every day that a world without policing and surveillance is possible. Therefore, we believe that in order for our work here at MediaJustice to be successful at achieving collective liberation, we must also align ourselves with abolition. However, we also believe that our movements need strategies to challenge the dominant narratives that justify and normalize policing. And given this lens, debunking these kinds of narratives require more than just replacing myths with fact. It's about analyzing power. So some of the key assumptions that we make throughout, and you can move to the next slide, team, are that, police are some of the biggest spreaders of disinformation, right? And that's because they have direct influence over the media that we consume and are regarded as the main source of information, right? So while the purpose of this curriculum is to help communities identify and map out how certain issues and policies are influenced by propaganda, we also hope that this curriculum is a resource to help us think through and map out building trusted information streams about policing and safety. So just in a moment, I'm going to pass it to our incredible organizer, National Field Organizer, Ramsha, who's been leading this project to do some more context setting and grounding. She'll walk us through what do we mean by propaganda and what you'll find in this curriculum. That'll be followed by a panel discussion with our project team, who collaborated with us for the last year and made this whole curriculum and training possible. We'll take a pause and take a look at the art that has been created by our visual note taker, Sarah. Thank you again for joining us this evening. And then we'll share some next steps and we'll share where to look for future disinformation trainings. But I do want to take a moment and just sincerely thank our project team, which includes the incredible leadership of our network members, such as Generation Justice, LineBreak Media, and CreaTV San Jose. But I also wanted to share our deep gratitude to Brian and Brandy, our team of researchers at the Technology and Social Change Project at Harvard, who worked on the case studies that are part of this curriculum. So thank you guys so much for your partnership. It's been incredible to work with you this past year, and we're so proud of what we've built together. So on that note, I'm going to pass it to Ramsha to get us started.
Hey folks, I will pin myself right now and then get started. Hey everyone. So I'm gonna, first off, I'm Ramsha Sajid. I'm our field organizer on policing and surveillance with MediaJustice. And I'm gonna share a bit about MediaJustice's approach to platform accountability. Our work has always been rooted in an abolitionist approach to organizing, especially against the harms of social media platforms. We know social media platforms collude with police in order to stifle our movements. I think of cities across the country where police use social media to track organizers on Facebook, Instagram, and other online spaces. But social media is often how our movements digitally relate to one another. So we hold the complexity of social media being a space where progressive movements have flourished, such as the movement for Black Lives and Occupy Wall Street. Yet we know that these online spaces are privately owned by big tech bros and billionaires whose bottom line is profit. Hate and disinformation in particular is profitable to big tech. And we've seen how these platforms are used as a place to surveil and harm and capture our social justice movements. On the next slide, you'll see screenshots from different publications, including our MediaJustice blog, related to our fight to regulate big tech platforms. Before I joined the MediaJustice team, former MediaJustice staff member Aaron Shields led a campaign against Facebook in 2017 after Facebook took down the live stream of Corinne Gaines' murder by police. Since then, MediaJustice has campaigned against Facebook due to their collaboration with police, as well as their censorship and surveillance of activists. On the next slide, you'll see examples of actions and campaigns against Facebook, including our call to fire Mark Zuckerberg, 5 actions for tech companies to take in defense of Black lives, and MediaJustice's campaign to protect Black dissent. Our media justice roots in the field of platform accountability and disinformation have always been and will continue to be abolitionist and supportive of the right to freely protest and organize on and offline. On the next slide, I'll talk more about how this work connects to why we chose Copaganda for this project. Our shift to focus on Copaganda is because of the ways disinformation spread by police threatens our movements and the ways police surveil our movements on and offline. In May 2022, I began doing listening sessions with nearly a dozen Media Justice Network members across the country, asking them, what types of disinformation affect your work? Through those interviews, I learned that disinformation spread by police is some of the most harmful forms of disinformation affecting our movements. We then collaborated with our network members, who Maisha already shouted out, but I want to name again. You'll be hearing from them shortly in our panel, and I'll say their names really slowly because I know we have interpretation here too. The first is LineBreak Media, CreaTV San Jose, and Generation Justice, as well as our partners at the Tech and Social Change Project and the Disinfo Defense League. We met many times in the months following our creation as a project team, and we identified instances of Copaganda in communities across the country for case studies, as well as building out questions together for activities in the curriculum. You can click through the curriculum through the link in the chat. It includes case studies, specifically 2 case studies. And if you're not familiar with a case study, it's basically like an in-depth research essay that debunks instances of Copaganda. And the 2 case studies we have took place in San Jose, California, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. In addition to the case studies, there are multiple thoughtful prompts and activities that work to support mapping police influence by media locally and building relationships between journalists and organizers. This curriculum is just the starting point to our trainings later this year, where we're going to be doing regional trainings across the country to build relationships between journalists, organizers, and media makers to fight back against Copaganda. Next slide, please. So what is Copaganda? I think you have to go back 1, please. Copaganda, how we define it, is when police or pro-police groups use their power to share a narrative, especially with loaded or emotionally charged language, in order to influence people's opinions for their benefit. This project is important to us because of the mass uptick in Copaganda following the uprisings of 2020 and the call to defund the police. Copaganda is one of the biggest threats to our movements. Right now, we're seeing the mass militarization of local police departments, an expansion of surveillance tools, and police brutality fueled by Copaganda. Most police departments have a dedicated marketing budget and public information officers that deal with the media. And for decades, police have been put into our minds as the only solution to violence. And when a major crisis happens, Copaganda is used to justify more policing, despite proof that policing does not address the root causes of violence in our communities. We're seeing the state of media and disinformation right now is precarious, with the consolidation of local news, Elon Musk taking over Twitter, and the privatization of libraries. All of that and more help sort of shape that through this project, we are resourcing ourselves and our communities on how to fight back against Copaganda and build trusted information streams as we get there. Next slide now, there are examples of Copaganda. Here you'll see screen grabs from the resource itself. In the curriculum, we name that Copaganda is not just a narrative, but also an action. So while conversations related to disinformation can be very privileged and intellectual, we want to stay rooted in the fact that disinformation is about power. You'll see in the first example of a propaganda narratives related to waves of immigrants and migrants and asylum seekers are often related to narratives linking people to crime or to securing the southern border. I see an example of this right now in Chicago, where we are seeing migrants arriving without enough social support outside of informally supported mutual aid groups. And the push of narratives linking these folks to crime, despite the fact that Chicago has been a sanctuary city since the 1980s. In the next example on the slide, you'll see movement protest is criminalized by propaganda narratives. And that's through using language that refers to protests as riots or linking protests to the destruction of property. The propaganda action in this case is then to criminalize dissent, especially through arresting peaceful protesters. We're seeing this right now in Cop City and Atlanta, where protesters are being charged with domestic terrorism. Right now, there is an attack on dissent and the right to protest anywhere, not just in relation to Cop City, but we're also seeing this when the Department of Homeland Security showed up at protests, not just about policing and surveillance, but when they showed up at reproductive justice protests after the Dobbs decision was overturned. We're seeing everywhere how propaganda stifles protests and criminalizes progressive movements. On the next slide, we'll talk about how propaganda affects perceptions of safety and harm. The case studies in this project that were written by the Technology and Social Change Project and informed by MediaJustice grassroots network members underscore how propaganda minimizes our collective perception of harm. So for example, in the case study about how Walgreens manufactured a crime wave, researchers debunked the oversaturation of stories related to drugstore theft in the Bay Area. When people hear stories like drugstore theft or other small crimes, it distorts their understanding of safety in their community and breeds fear for people, fear of the unknown, fear of their neighbors, and fear of one another. And this level of mistrust has real consequences in how people relate to one another and cannot be separated from the mass uptick of gun violence in this country either. People often believe crime is much worse in their communities than it actually is because of media messaging propaganda and local crime beats dedicated to spreading paranoia. And what is crime anyway, right? Like, it's socially constructed. And on the next slide, we'll talk more about that. We know crime is socially constructed. We hear so many stories of small theft from stores, but rarely do we hear corporations held accountable for breaking the law. The scale of harm by corporations affects millions, but rarely do we see news of corporations being held responsible for things like wage theft by CEOs or for the release of toxic chemicals into the environment, for surveilling and extracting our data. There is a huge information gap of companies being held accountable to the mass harm that they cause us. Although crime levels are much lower now than they were decades ago, we are told stories that push policing as a solution and distract from major corporate harms done to our communities. And with that context, I will now shift us into talking to our panelists who have been a part of the creation process for this curriculum for the last year. I am so grateful for this group of people who have sat through many meetings tending to the research and questions in our curriculum. We can, I think, stop the screen share and then spotlight our panelists now. This group is really what has made this project take its form, and I really want to celebrate all of you in this process. So we're going to get our panelists up now. I'm going to wait for all of them to join the screen before we start. Okay, I think that's all of us. Hey, y'all. How's it going? So as mentioned before, this project was brought together by MediaJustice Network members, researchers, youth radio hosts, policy experts, And these folks are here as our panel right now. Could you all go around and share about yourself, the organization you come from, and what about this project excites you?
I can go first. My name is Frankie. I use they and them pronouns. I'm the education and community manager at CreaTV. For folks who are not familiar with CreaTV San Jose, we are the public access television station and community media access center for San Jose. A lot of our work revolves around addressing issues of equity in the media landscape. So we offer classes and other long form educational programming to our community to provide folks with access to the skills and mentorship and community to be able to produce their own stories and control their own narratives about their communities. And I'm super excited to be here today. I've been working along with MediaJustice and this team, gosh, maybe over a year. Ramsha, correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm just super excited because all the folks here are super passionate about supporting our communities in a variety of different ways. And the work that I've seen people do is really incredible. So I'm really excited to share that work with you all today.
And I'm Nadia. I take she, her pronouns. I'm with LineBreak Media. We are based in the Twin Cities, and we're a video production group that focuses on creating media that are issue-based, movement-based, mission-based. And we've been a longtime partner of MediaJustice for a while. And I've been blessed to be a part of this group for the past year in this Copaganda Clapback project. And yeah, I think I was really excited about this project. My background is in video production as well as video journalism, and I think since 2020, the uprising for the murder of George Floyd by the city of Minneapolis and its police department, there has been an explosion of independent media and an explosion of a conversation of what makes a credible news source and who does that need to be and who needs to own that. And that's in the hands of community, and that takes being on the ground. So that's what really drew me into this project and is making me really, really excited about the potential and what we could really get out of this.
Thanks, Nadia. Thanks, Frankie. Brian, do you want to go next?
Sure. Brian, he, him pronouns. I'm a senior researcher on the technology and social change team. I'm the co-author of the 2022 book, Meme Wars, that looks at the way far-right politics on the internet have sort of gone mainstream through mass media and through political adoption. This project was very interesting to me because as someone who's been looking at things that have sort of coded as extremism, i.e. things that aren't normal for America, after years of studying the movements, it became clear and clear that this is actually very, very normal for America, and that if we just focus on what the national security state views as to be domestic extremists, etc., we're missing a huge segment of power, particularly the power of mainstream media, police, and how that is relationship is used to construct not only official data, but sort of the mediated reality that a lot of us are having to deal with.
Thanks, Brian. Brandy, Jaime, Isha, do y'all want to go next? Maybe in that order? Cool.
Yep. I'll jump in. I have to switch to the phone. So is my audio okay? Great. Brandy Collins Dexter, she, her, hers, also at the Tech and Social Change Project. I once worked at MediaJustice for a few years, and so I've always kind of been excited about anything that MediaJustice does, and it's kind of like a groupie for that work. And so it was a no-brainer to be a part of this project, but also my book, Black Skinhead, Reflections on Blackness and Our Political Future, really focuses on the loss of community-owned and controlled infrastructure and spaces, and what happens when we don't always have the venues to tell our own story, who tells those stories for us, what happens when those that seek to maintain and consolidate power are then the narrators of our everyday lives. And so the connection between that and this work is, if we want to have research that matters, we have to do that in a way that truly centers communities and not just pay lip service to that, and truly understand that the research is a work in progress that doesn't involve, one person, as the researcher dictating to other groups what the solutions or issues or problems are in their communities, but working together to really understand the landscape and pair knowledge. And I really also will say before I shut up that without that knowledge that I was able to get from Frankie, I wouldn't have been able to understand so much about what was happening in San Jose, or to be able to do this case study. And it would have been a case study that was missing a lot of important elements. And so just reinforces the need for social justice movements and research spaces to really be more integrated. And yeah, that's my bit.
I can jump in next, though. I don't know if Isha was supposed to go next, but okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Jaime Longoria. My pronouns are he, they, and I work at the Disinfo Defense League. My work at DDL involves managing research and training for a large network of civil society organizations who are all working together to combat the harmful effects of racialized disinformation, which we define as information that seeks to sustain white supremacy and consolidate power among the ruling classes. A lot of the work that we've done in the past has been sort of piecemeal. DDL was set up to be somewhat of a rapid response network that is now slowly evolving. And I say that because I think what I'm so excited about when seeing this type of work come together is not only folks who I've worked with in community before come together around a topic that we have been watching for a while, but also creating something that seems whole, something that's comprehensive, something that I think really gets at the roots of how we can begin to defang the power of propaganda, which is, I think, really, I believe very strongly that it is one of the first steps towards abolition. For years, being doing the type of research that I do, sort of reacting to police killings, reacting to specific protests here and there, we see a lot of these incidents in which you see the mechanisms move in terms of how these narratives get shopped into the mainstream, and I think for at least from my perspective, this is one of the first resources that I've seen that really lays down the map of how that works. And I think, just echoing what Brandy said, it's very important that this work was done not just in an isolated researcher space, right? We were in conversation with community that I think brought a lot to the table. And yeah, I'll throw it to you, Isha. Thank you.
Thanks, Jaime. Hi, everyone. I'm Isha Ramanujam. I use she, her pronouns. I am a research fellow on Brandy and Brian's team at the Tech and Social Change Project at Shorenstein Center. And I also work with the Disinfo Defense League research team. I've been studying racialized disinformation with a focus on racist pseudoscience and community-specific narrative interventions. And I was brought onto this project when I joined the team last year. My background is in strategic campaigns research, specifically for racial justice with a focus on tech accountability and media justice. So a lot of this was really exciting for me. And similar to what a lot of folks have said before, I think I'm really excited. I think in the introduction of the report written by Ramsha, there's this line about how debunking Copaganda is not about the quest for objectivity, it's about analyzing power. And to me, that's everything that's exciting about this report. And it's why I do research. It's for power, it's for creating change, it's for building momentum and satisfying curiosity in service of that, not just for its own sake. And I think that resources like this and conversations like this or projects like this are why that happens. So I'm really excited to be a part of it. Don't know who else is left, but I'll pass it back to you, Ramsha.
Yeah, I think that was all of us. Thank you all so much. We have a lot of expertise in the room, right? Like from researchers to like organizers, media makers, journalists. Right now, I'm also missing some of our youth radio hosts who I wish could be part of the conversation today, but couldn't make it. I definitely want to highlight them and their work. Generation Justice, who really allowed us the honor of collaborating with youth and hosting youth-only feedback sessions on the curriculum. Much love and gratitude to y'all if y'all are watching recording. And now shifting into the curriculum itself, a big part of this work has been our case studies, right? And through our network members, as you all mentioned, identifying instances of Copaganda they've seen, our researchers work to build and debunk those Copaganda narratives. And so I'm curious if some folks can share more about the case study that you worked on, what you learned from the process, or what surprised you.
I can jump in there. So I worked with Frankie, as mentioned earlier, and San Jose team on Walgreens. It actually ended up being 2 case studies in one because there were so many different elements to it. So the original piece that we looked at was how Nextdoor, as a community-based app, was spreading information around retail theft and how that was being used to accelerate policies that were displacing people from the community, how that was used in elections as a way to bring a more tough on crime, law and order type of policymaking into the community, as well as accelerate surveillance in that community. And so we started off looking at the case study, and somebody had posted something that claimed that a Walgreens had been closed because of organized retail theft. And there was no Walgreens in the location they were identifying. And so when I talked to Frankie, it turned out it was actually a CVS. But for me, I had a question of why people were so adamant about it being a Walgreens. And so looking into this narrative around Walgreens took us into this rabbit hole where we learned that Walgreens had been giving falsified numbers on calls with shareholders around the scale of quote unquote organized retail theft, and using that as a way to justify mass losses and increase surveillance and more private policing in their stores. I don't know, Frankie, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I would love to hop in and just say what an incredible experience it was to work with Brandy on this case, and just kind of like piggyback off what Ramsha said around like working together. I think Brandy, you also were talking about like the power of working together, because these were all just little things that I had noticed over time, like the you know, over the course of the pandemic, hearing about like organized crime, especially in the Bay Area, where I'm based, you know, hearing the kind of like pro-policing narratives in our local politics, and then also there being some pushes for more surveillance as part of those like political platforms. So it was really fascinating to see all these little tidbits around that I had been hearing and just experiencing and kind of having questions about, to see Brandy pull out this incredible kind of like campaign on Walgreens half and all of these connections that were kind of making it so that I was encountering these little bits and pieces all over the place. So that was one thing that I found really fascinating about the case study, and also just wanted to express my extreme gratitude to Brandy for doing a lot of the legwork on some of that deep research and following some of the little rabbit holes that I uncovered. So thank you so much, Brandy.
One more quick thing, sorry, before we move. In terms of two surprises for me, one was like in this case, one of the core assumptions of the work is that the police are the biggest spreaders of disinformation, which is true. What was interesting about this case study is that the police were actually sidelined in this story. So it was a combination of Walgreens and people doing facial recognition technology and trying to bring surveillance into the community, and small business owners that were kind of the lead voices pushing false information, and doing that in a way that actually circumvented the need for police validation. And the second thing that I thought was interesting was language in there. We kept seeing the same number, a set of numbers that seemed to be laying out a case for a certain tough on crime policy. And it turned out that a lot of the language that was being used in media was language that came from American Legislative Exchange Council draft bills from the early 2000s. And so they were bringing that language back and using media to bring in sort of new regulation. So I want to uplift those aspects as well.
Thank you both so much for that. I really appreciate how hyper-local some of your findings were in that process. And I think in this process, we were so intentional about building case studies that are local and regional. And it means a lot to have representation from San Jose, California, and Minneapolis, which I feel like Minneapolis has been the focus of national headlines for a long time. And so to be specific about Copaganda in Minneapolis, regionally and locally, and be really precise in that is really subversive, I think. Do you all have ideas on, and I'm going to look to you, Nadia, on what is the value add of focusing regionally on Minneapolis? Why does it matter that we're doing this work locally and regionally rather than at a national scale?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ramsha. I think with local and regional analysis of issues like Copaganda, obviously those issues of relating to police, it stems from local governments, from police interactions. Those are usually happening and regulated and controlled at the hands of something you control at a local scale. And every instance is different, and it's happening at such a deep community level. So you need to have people who are on the ground that experienced these issues that aren't just one case of an instance. This is usually something that's leading up to it. It's building. Like with the uprising, it wasn't like the murder of George Floyd wasn't the tipping point. It was the lead up. It was all the other killings of community members that led up to that, and all the community members that were there for that and saw that, and could really give context and synthesize that. It's also for the sake of like sustainability too. Like when we talk about these issues and you know, we come to these ideas, who are these directly impacting and who are these directly affecting? And it's those folks at home who are on the ground and actually taking measures into their own hands. Like we saw a lot of independent media, and that was just neighbors going around live streaming and saying like, I'm the news source now. Like, like I'm seeing stuff that are happening that are going under the radar, and I'm going to tell the rest of my community because it's in our collective best interest. So that's kind of the case for it, where it's really like, who is this directly affecting, and whose best interest does it serve? So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Nadia. We have a question from one of our attendees related to what you said around, you know, we're going to make our own news media now. We're going to be the source now. What are some steps journalists and other media makers can take towards transforming their approach and moving away from Copaganda? And that's an open question to anyone.
I can take this. Yeah, I think the biggest thing too is transforming their approach and moving away from propaganda. That also means like moving away from like trying to be this idea of, you know, an objective, neutral, this will establish my credibility as a media maker, kind of hinging the reputation or what looks like a reputable news source. Because we're all trying to make sense of what that journalism right now is being redefined and defined right now. And we know that objectivity just is not giving the accurate and transparent results. So yeah, I think it's more so about focusing more so on the sake of like transparency, and are you being truthful to the communities that you're writing to, and do you know who you're talking to and who your readership is, and are you writing to them and for them?
Thank you for that. I think those were really actionable steps. Jaime, I know you work with a lot of journalists as well, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on that question of how can people resource themselves?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that's very important is for communities to be able to position themselves as authoritative voices about what is going on in their daily lives and in the neighborhoods that they live in. You know, there's this very I have a journalist background in journalism, and it was drilled into my head that you check everything. Even if your mom tells you she loves you, you check that, but somehow that doesn't apply to the police. So it's important to know that journalists are not immune to the allure of propaganda. And I think some important questions to consider is like what information do cops have that we need as a public? And what are the mechanisms that we can start to put into motion to take that information out of their hands in a more formal, maybe even like a bureaucratic way, so that we don't have to depend on an institution that has proven to lack transparency and has the funding to really frame public discourse because they have such ownership of information, right? I think there also has to be a lot of investment in the transparency of how the data is collected, that the data that they have is collected, and our access to that data, so that we can begin to see like what sort of lenses are being propagated whenever cops come on the news and pose as experts, right? And I think like the other thing to consider as well is that you know, there's this question about like authority and bias in communities, and usually police are seen as unbiased. But the truth is that, you know, we're up against an enormous system that has shown not only to collude with right-wing extremists and white supremacists, but sometimes, a lot of times, they're one and the same. So you know, it's important to be able to shift perceptions, shift away the resources, shift away the data into hands that are trustworthy. And I really believe that's community.
Thanks, Jaime. Yeah, and I think you're right in naming, I think all of what you said was so on point. And I think especially what you named around, like, this is a giant system. Like, this is not just the byproduct of police having the mic. It is a problem with the state of our media right now. In the last year, we've seen that the state of our media is precarious. We've seen Elon Musk take over Twitter. We see local news be consolidated and defunded. We've seen the fight against libraries and anti-critical race theory movements. I'm curious how you all think this curriculum responds to the role media plays in spreading propaganda. And I would love to hear from Brian or Isha. I know we haven't heard from y'all yet.
I can go first. Yeah. So I think one of the important things that this resource also speaks to is meeting people where they are. Alternate institutions are important, but the everyday cultural inputs in people's lives matter, in addition to platform intervention, moderation intervention, in other ways. One of the things that we've been looking into includes like reality television, like these TV shows that follow police forces in the day-to-day. There were some that were canceled in 2020 in response to public pressure and then are now back on the air, often with audiences even bigger than the people that they directly impact on the day-to-day. There's this narrative that's being created on such a large scale from people who might not get information from anywhere else. And I think that in the absence of clear explanations for harm that people experience on a day-to-day basis because of institutional lacks, those same institutional lacks are the reason that they don't necessarily get an explanation for what they're experiencing, and they can become susceptible to manipulation. The absence of that available information online or in schools or in libraries, those are actively harming people in the same way that in the way that they're not providing information just as much as they are lacks and harms in and of themselves. So I think that there's a kind of saliency to narratives that offer them either someone to blame or even a false hero in their local police force. So there's these specific opportunities on social media. There's some work in the case study on Walgreens about Nextdoor that provide specific opportunities for people to find community with each other, and through that assign credibility to the narratives presented to them that like explain their grievances in some way. So those everyday cultural inputs really, really matter. And I think that the way that this resource is set up allows people to map the power of those inputs in a really new and interesting way. And I think that those interventions, that's how you find interventions, is to understand that people interact with policing in ways beyond direct interpersonal interaction, and even like police social media interaction, that they happen in media spaces that are not defined by that don't necessarily even share financial ties to policing, but might see benefit to spreading narratives that align with policing for other reasons.
Thanks so much, Isha. And then Brian, I want to make some space too for you to share if you have any thoughts.
Absolutely. Journalists are people, and people have needs and agendas all of their own. And when we were putting together the case study, it wasn't necessarily that individual reporters were sort of being blown up for their role in this, but it was fascinating with some of the initial information that Nadia provided about how media ride-alongs preceded two very significant events in defeats for abolitionist causes. First, in 2021, the defeat of the Yes for Minneapolis defund campaign, and then in 2022 preceded the city budget, where the police were actually refunded significantly. So we were, certain reporters' names were coming up. A lot of this case study is sort of reporting about reporting, because if we were just sort of uncritically looking at these news sources, but if you look at them sort of in their totality, and then juxtapose that with what folks are saying on the ground, what the front line of activists are saying and experiencing, you actually start to see patterns that you couldn't see if you were just looking at media sources. One of the most interesting sort of surprises of putting this together were two things. One, that a very important critical human rights report that folks in Minneapolis put out actually used ride-alongs, civilian ride-alongs with police to get an idea of what police were doing. So we're not saying with this case, like, oh, the ride-along programs themselves are the problem. It's this mediated, the access ride-alongs. And one of the things we even noticed was that there was sort of inter-right infighting about who gets to access the police via ride-along. So the sort of problems between, I don't know, more independent right-wing media and Fox News, the support for each other, but also that certain people weren't given access, and therefore they weren't actually able to contribute to the narrative. So we can't just sort of write off that police ride-alongs are something that should be shut down before we shut down the police, because otherwise, again, it will be very hard to gather firsthand data And again, comparing that to activist experiences and sort of what activists have seen on the ground, you can kind of see patterns in reporting. Certain reporters who may be more critical of police, after a ride along, their story may change. And we've seen that happen several times.
Thanks so much, Brian. And thank you all so much, panelists. Like, it has been such a gift working with you on this project. I know we're sort of strapped for time, and there is so much to sit with what our panelists have shared today. Our work doesn't stop here. We're going to continue our work as in regional trainings across the country. We're going to hope to connect organizers, media makers, and journalists together in person for regional trainings. And I know that there are some questions in the Q&A. We're going to follow up post-call with answers to those questions and additional resources. If we didn't get to your question today, it will be answered in our follow-up email. So thank you so much. Everyone, please give it up for our amazing panelists. Thanks, y'all. And now I'm going to pass it to Sarah, who is our graphic note taker. The audience can look at Sarah's screen while she zooms in. I'm going to remove spotlights from our panelists as well in the meantime. But Sarah, please feel free to share a little bit behind your thinking for your art piece that you created for us today in your graphic notes, or any other notes you want to share.
Sure, this is Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can hear you.
Amazing. Okay, well, so this is the draft of the Copaganda Clapback Hour. Here's the definition of Copaganda. A couple of pieces to lift up: that social media is functioning both as a mechanism for movement building and power and information sharing, and also simultaneously is being used to surveil and police. I tried to pick out the pieces of the curriculum itself, which includes case studies, activities, and specific examples that you all lifted up. And the specific case study here of Walgreens, and a quote lifted up in the intro, which was, "Debunking Copaganda is about analyzing power." So trying to map where power lies within these specific examples. So I tried to make the visual also look like a map. Here are the folks involved in the creation of this curriculum. And then in the Q&A, there were a couple of pieces that stood out, specifically that journalists are not immune to Copaganda, that communities can be positioned as experts, and simultaneously we need to be problematizing the data that cops have is also data that potentially should be within the hands of community members. And folks who are in journalism being really clear about their audience and writing to and for them. So those are some pieces of this hour.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's amazing. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure having you. This is beautiful. Participants, you will receive Sarah's art in our follow-up email after this event. Thank you. With that, I will pass it to back to our presentation, actually, to talk a little bit about what can we do right now to clap back against Copaganda. So these examples are from page 60 in the resource that we've shared with you all today. You can learn more about what you can do to clap back against Copaganda through taking some action steps on this slide, right? So you can be critical of crime statistics, keep telling your stories, pre-bunk the Copaganda, which means interfering in a Copaganda narrative before it actually happens, and doing political education within your communities on policing. We welcome you to use the activities in our curriculum to build with other media makers and organizers and journalists. And if you are interested in signing up for a regional training near you, please use the Google form in the chat. We know from our in-depth case studies that narratives of propaganda are really hyper-local. And so we're going to be training journalists, organizers, and media makers in the Media Justice Network to come together in cities across the country to create those solutions together. And so please, if you're interested, fill out that form. And then I'll shift us to our closing and our last slide. And so that brings us to the closing out of our event. Thank you all so much for attending this event. If you want to sustain the movement against policing and disinformation, scan the QR code on the screen, or follow the link in the chat by Brandon to donate to Media Justice, to support the collaborations, the staff, the research that makes our work possible. Thank you all so much. Have a great evening, and thank you to our panelists. Take care, y'all.
Mima used to tell a story about the earth and all the glory. Used to say that it was more than dirt. All the kids would gather around, sitting on the ground, and she'd tell us what it's worth. She said, teach them.